The rain in Westchester was unlike the rain in the city. It was cold, primitive, and felt as though it were trying to wash away the very sins of the earth. In a secluded corner of a forgotten cemetery, the mud was thick and black, clinging to the expensive leather shoes of the men who stood there. Tony the tailor Moretti, a man Frank Costello had personally promoted to captain 5 years ago, held a snub-nosed .38 with a steady hand. His face was lit by the dim, flickering glow of a single flashlight resting on a pile of freshly overturned dirt. Before them lay a rectangular void, a hole 6 feet deep, carved out of the shivering ground. Frank Costello stood at the very edge of that pit. His shoulders square, his hands clasped behind his back as if he were contemplating a piece of fine art rather than his own final resting place. The silence between the two men was heavier than the sodden earth, broken only by the rhythmic splash of rain against the lid of a nearby marble crypt. Tony's voice was shaky, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of a man who believed he was about to inherit a kingdom. "Vito said you were getting slow, Frank. He said you spent too much time talking to judges and not enough time watching your back. Look at you now." The Prime Minister of the Underworld, standing at the edge of a hole in the mud. No bodyguards. No lawyers. No escape. Frank Costello didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the gun. He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the desolate landscape of gravestones and skeletal trees. "You always had a flair for the dramatic, Tony. The tailor. You liked the way things looked on the surface. The suits, the cars, the prestige. But you never understood the architecture beneath the fabric," Costello said, his voice a low, raspy velvet that seemed to vibrate in the very air. He stepped an inch closer to the edge, the mud crumbling beneath his heels. "You think this hole was dug for me? You think Vito Genovese has the imagination to bury a man like me in a place like this? You've been working for him for 6 months, Tony. I've known about your promotion since the first day you sat in his social club. Did you really think I'd walk into the woods with a traitor unless I already knew where the bodies were buried?" Tony's grip on the revolver tightened, his knuckles turning white. "It doesn't matter what you knew, Frank. I've got the gun. I've got the hole. By morning, Vito is the boss of bosses, and you're just a missing persons report that the cops will stop caring about in a week. If you are watching this and you are beginning to feel the chilling reality of what happens when a protege tries to strike at his master, then you are witnessing the absolute peak of psychological warfare. Most people think power is the gun in Tony's hand. But true power, Costello's power, is the reason the gun hasn't fired yet. If you want to understand how to turn your own execution into a trap that erases your enemies from existence, you are in the right place. We are breaking down the moment the Prime Minister proved that you can never bury a man who owns the ground you're standing on. Hit that subscribe button right now to join the inner circle of those who master the shadows. Like this video to show that you recognize the difference between a thug with a weapon and a legend with a plan. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type "grave" in all caps. Let's see who among you has the nerves to stand at the edge and not blink. Now, let's go back to that hole, where Tony Moretti was about to realize that he was holding a dead man's hand. Costello finally turned his full attention to Tony. His eyes were not filled with the pleading of a victim, they were filled with the cold, clinical boredom of a teacher watching a failing student. "Vito didn't tell you the most important part of this hit, did he, Tony?" Costello asked, taking a slow, deliberate step away from the grave and toward the man holding the gun. Tony flinched, stepping back, his boots slipping in the mud. "Stay back, Frank. I'll do it. I'll blow your head off right here." Costello kept coming, his presence expanding until it seemed to fill the entire cemetery. "He didn't tell you that I bought this cemetery 10 years ago under a shell company. He didn't tell you that the 2 men who dug this hole for you this afternoon are currently sitting in my kitchen, eating manicotti and waiting for my phone call. And he certainly didn't tell you that the man who gave you this gun, the loyal Genovese soldier who dropped you off at the gate, is the same man who called me an hour ago to tell me exactly where you'd be." The color vanished from Tony's face. The cocky bravado he had worn like a suit of armor began to melt away, leaving only the raw, trembling fear of a man who realized the maze he was in had no exit. He looked at the gun in his hand as if it were a poisonous snake. "You're lying, Tony hissed, though the conviction was gone from his voice. Vito said I'd be a capo. He said I'd have the docks. Costello let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering over stone. Vito promises everyone the docks, Tony. It's his favorite lie. But look around you. Does this look like the docks? Does this look like a promotion? You were sent here to be a loose end. Vito knew I'd catch you. He wanted me to kill you so he could use your death to start a war. He's too coward to fight himself. You were the bait, Tony. But you're too small to catch a shark like me. Costello reached into his coat and pulled out a small, silver lighter. He sparked it, the flame dancing in the rain, lighting up the deep lines of his face. He didn't light a cigar, he just watched the fire. At this very moment, your wife is being escorted to a safe house. Not by Vito's men, but by mine. Your bank accounts have been emptied. You're Taylor, a shop in Brooklyn? It caught fire 20 minutes ago. You don't have a life to go back to, Tony. You don't even have a name anymore. Costello looked down into the dark, wet pit and then back at the trembling man. He whispered the words that would haunt Tony's final moments of sanity, words that were as heavy as a tombstone. You brought me here to show me my grave, Tony. But look closer at the dirt. Look at the measurements. This hole wasn't dug for an old man like me. It was dug for someone your size. The man inside this grave is actually you. As the words left Costello's lips, a series of clicks echoed from the darkness behind the gravestones. For shadows emerged from the rain, their long coats billowing like the wings of vultures. These were Costello's janitors, the men who cleaned up the messes that the Prime Minister didn't want to touch. They didn't have guns drawn, they didn't need them. Their presence alone was a death sentence. Tony spun around, pointing his .38 at the shadows, but his hand was shaking so violently the barrel was tracing circles in the air. He looked back at Costello, his eyes wide and leaking tears that mixed with the rain. Frank. Uncle Frank, please. I was confused. Vito, he twisted my head. I've been loyal for 15 years. You can't do this. Costello didn't respond to the plea. He simply closed the silver lighter with a sharp clink and turned his back on the man. He began to walk away, his footsteps steady and rhythmic on the gravel path. I didn't do this, Tony, Costello said over his shoulder, his voice fading into the wind. You dug this hole the moment you thought a title from a man like Vito was worth more than a life of loyalty to a man like me. Enjoy the silence. It's the only thing Vito ever truly gives his soldiers. Tony let out a primal scream of rage and despair, pulling the trigger of the .38. Click! He pulled it again. Click! The gun was empty. The firing pin struck nothing but air. Costello hadn't just known about the hit, he had orchestrated the very weapon used in it. The shadows closed in. Tony Moretti, the man who wanted to be a king, fell to his knees at the edge of the pit. He looked down into the blackness and realized that Costello was right, the grave was a perfect fit. The rain continued to fall, burying the sounds of the struggle, burying the pleas for mercy, and eventually, burying the man who had dared to think he could outsmart the Prime Minister. Frank Costello walked out of the cemetery gates and into the back of a waiting limousine, his face as calm as the surface of a deep, dark lake. The night of the grave was over, but the message was just beginning to spread through the 5 boroughs. You can plot, you can betray, and you can dig all the holes you want, but in Frank Costello's world, it's always Frank who decides exactly who is going to lie inside that hole. The mud in the Westchester Cemetery didn't just cling to Tony Moretti's boots, it felt like it was swallowing his very soul. As Frank Costello walked away, the 4th janitors didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The psychological weight of Costello's revelation had already paralyzed Tony. He sat on the edge of the pit he had dug for his mentor, staring into the dark, wet void. The rain continued to pour, turning the bottom of the grave into a pool of black ink. Tony looked at the empty .38 in his hand, the ultimate symbol of his betrayal and his failure. He was a man who had been outplayed in a game he didn't even realize he was playing. One of the janitors, a man with a face like a tombstone. stepped forward and held out a hand. Not to pull Tony out, but to take the gun. Tony handed it over without a word. He was no longer the tailor. He was just a man in a wet suit, shivering in a hole. "You're not going to kill me?" Tony whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The janitor looked down at him with a cold, detached pity. "The boss said you're not worth the paperwork, Tony. He said a man who tries to kill his father doesn't deserve the mercy of a quick end. He wants you to see what the world looks like when you don't exist anymore." At that moment, Tony realized that the death Costello had planned for him was far more sophisticated than a bullet. It was an erasure. While Tony was kept in that cemetery for the next 3 hours, watching the janitors slowly fill the grave with the very dirt he had excavated, the Prime Minister's machine was dismantling his life brick by brick. By the time the grave was level with the ground again, Tony Moretti had been wiped from the face of the earth. If you are watching this and you realize that the most terrifying power isn't the ability to take a life, but the ability to take away a person's identity, then you are seeing the true face of the Costello empire. Most bosses would have left a body in the woods as a warning. But Costello? He understood that a body is a piece of evidence. A ghost, however, is a legend that keeps everyone else in line. He didn't just survive an assassination, he used it to prove that he is the architect of everyone's reality. If you want to learn how to master systemic dominance, the art of winning so completely that your enemy has nowhere to run and no one to turn to, then you are exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now to join the Brotherhood of the High-Level Thinkers. Like this video to show that you recognize the genius of the bloodless purge. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type legacy in all caps. Let's see who among you understands that your name is your only real currency. Now, let's go back to the aftermath, where Vito Genovese was about to receive a package that would change the history of the 5 families. While Tony was being driven to a windowless basement in a Brooklyn safe house, Frank Costello was sitting in the back of his limousine, making a single phone call. He didn't call the police, and he didn't call his hitmen. He called the head of the Commission's Dispute Resolution Committee. "Vito has lost his grip on his people," Costello said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "One of his captains tried to settle a business matter in a private cemetery tonight. It was messy. It was unprofessional. And most importantly, it was a failure. I believe it's time for a sit-down." By the time the sun rose over the New York skyline, the word had spread. The hit on Costello had failed. And more importantly, the tailor had vanished. The mystery of Tony's disappearance began to eat at the Genovese family from the inside out. If Costello had killed him and left the body, Vito could have used it to rally his troops. But the silence? The silence was a poison. Vito Genovese spent that morning in his social club, pacing like a caged tiger. He had expected a phone call from Tony saying the job was done. Instead, he received a delivery. A small, wooden box was placed on his desk by a courier who vanished before anyone could ask questions. Inside the box was not a finger, nor a tongue, nor any of the usual messages of the underworld. Inside was a perfectly tailored, miniature suit jacket, the kind Tony used to make as a hobby, rendered in funeral black. Tucked into the pocket was a single, silver button from the coat Frank Costello had been wearing in the cemetery. There was no note. There was no threat. There was only the evidence that Costello had been there, he had seen the betrayal, and he had walked away as the victor. The message was clear: "I know what you did, and I have the man who did it for you." The real brilliance of Costello's move was what happened to Tony Moretti. Tony wasn't tortured for information, Costello already had all the information he needed. Instead, Tony was kept in total isolation for a week. Every day, he was shown a newspaper. He saw his own tailor shop being renovated by a new owner, one of Costello's men. He saw his wife and children being moved to a beautiful estate in Florida, living under a new name, provided for by a mystery benefactor. He saw his own name being stripped from the books of the 5 families. He was a man who was alive, but who had no place in the world. He was the ghost of Westchester, a man who had tried to dig a grave for a king and ended up burying himself. After 7 days, Costello walked into the basement. He didn't bring a gun. He brought a glass of wine and a bus ticket. "You have two choices, Tony," Costello said, sitting across from the man who had tried to murder him. "You can walk out of here, go to the police, and try to reclaim your life. But you'll find that Tony Moretti is dead. Your bank accounts are empty. Your house is in another man's name. Your family? They believe you abandoned them and that I am the one who saved them from the debt you left behind. If you go back, Vito will kill you for failing. If you go to the feds, I'll have you dead before you reach the witness stand. Or," Costello paused, taking a sip of the wine, "you take this ticket. You go to a small town in Oregon. You work in a dry cleaner. You never speak the name of Costello's again. You live a long, boring, quiet life. You live with the knowledge that the man you tried to kill is the only reason your children aren't starving." Tony Moretti took the ticket. He had no choice. He had been defeated not by force, but by the overwhelming weight of Costello's superior mind. He realized that Frank Costello didn't just rule the city, he owned the very concept of the city. He owned the judges, the banks, the homes, and even the memories of the people in them. To fight Costello wasn't just to fight a man, it was to fight the entire system of New York itself. Tony walked out of that basement, a broken shell of a man, and disappeared into the anonymity of the American West. He became a living ghost, a man who would spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, wondering if every shadow was one of the janitors coming to finish the job. The night of the grave effectively ended the Genovese rebellion for nearly a decade. Vito was humiliated. He had lost his best captain, he had been outplayed by a man he called soft, and he had been shown that the commission would always side with the man who could maintain order without spilling blood on the front page of the New York Times. Costello's non-violent philosophy was proven to be the most violent weapon of all. It didn't just destroy your body, it destroyed your existence. Frank Costello returned to his penthouse, his signet ring gleaming in the light of the fireplace. He had stared into his own grave and seen the future, and in that future, he was still the one holding the shovel, as the credits roll on this chapter of the Prime Minister's life. Remember the lesson of the cemetery: the most dangerous man isn't the one holding the gun. It's the one who knows how to make the gun irrelevant. Frank Costello's legacy isn't built on the bodies he dropped, but on the lives he controlled. He proved that true power is invisible, it is absolute, and it is patient. If you want to build an empire that can survive any betrayal, you have to be willing to stand at the edge of the pit and not blink. You have to be the one who decides who is lying in the dirt. We'll see you in the next episode, where we'll see what happens when the Prime Minister finally meets a rival who has nothing left to lose. Stay sharp, stay calculated, and never forget, the House of Costello always gets its due.